Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing the fascinating journey of European nationalism. We're going to follow it from a utopian dream all the way to the gritty, world-changing reality of modern nation-states. You know, today, a map of Europe shows neatly defined countries with crystal-clear borders. But it absolutely wasn't always like this. For centuries, the continent was just a chaotic, constantly shifting patchwork of massive empires, tiny kingdoms, and fragmented city-states. So how on earth did we transition from that messy web of royal territories into the unified, independent nations we recognize today? Well, that is exactly what we're going to unpack.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The dream of nations, 2. Defining a nation, 3. The French Revolution, 4. The age of Napoleon, and finally 5. The rise of liberal nationalism.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the dream of nations, visualizing a democratic world.
We're actually starting off not with a map or a dusty list of dates, but with a remarkable piece of art that envisioned a radically new, unified world long before it ever truly existed. Back in 1848, a French artist named Frédéric Souriau created this incredible, highly detailed utopian print called Democratic and Social Republics. It shows men and women of all ages and social classes marching past the Statue of Liberty together. And if you look closely at the foreground, you'll see the shattered remains of absolute monarchies, literally crowns and scepters just tossed in the dirt. In Souriau's grand vision, people aren't grouped by who their king is, but as distinct nations, identified entirely by their flags and national costumes. It was this beautiful, radical dream of worldwide democratic republics at a time when monarchs still completely ruled the continent.
Moving on to Section 2, defining a nation, more than just geography.
So before we can figure out how these nations actually formed in the real world, we have to ask a pretty fundamental question. What exactly is a nation? Is it simply lines drawn on a map? Well, French philosopher Ernest Renan brilliantly tackled this in a highly influential 1882 lecture. He argued that a true nation isn't just about sharing a common language, race, religion, or territory. Instead, he said it's built upon shared heroic pasts and a present will to perform great deeds together. He called it a large-scale solidarity. It's this profound bond that requires a shared history of sacrifice, shared glories, and crucially, a genuine ongoing desire to keep living together.
And that brings us to Renan's concept of the daily plebiscite. Now, a plebiscite is basically a direct vote where all the people of a region either accept or reject a proposal. By using this exact political term, Renan is telling us that a nation isn't something forced onto people by a distant ruler or an ancient king. Rather, it's a daily, collective choice by the inhabitants themselves to stay united. It relies 100% on the ongoing active consent of its people.
Section 3, the French Revolution, forging collective identity.
So when did this active consent suddenly explode onto the world stage? The French Revolution of 1789. These revolutionaries didn't just violently overthrow a monarch. They deliberately engineered a brand new collective French identity from scratch. They introduced ideas like la patrie, the fatherland, and le citoyen, the citizen, emphasizing equal constitutional rights for everyone over the old system of royal subjects. They swapped out the royal standard for the new tricolor flag. They centralized the government and created uniform laws. To connect the country commercially, they abolished internal customs duties and standardized weights and measures. They even pushed Parisian French as the sole common language, actively discouraging regional dialects. Every single one of these steps was a calculated, sweeping measure to forge one unified nation out of a deeply divided kingdom.
Section 4, the age of Napoleon, exporting the revolution.
Now we get to see how these revolutionary ideas were violently carried across European borders. Napoleon is such a fascinating historical contradiction, isn't he? On the one hand, he effectively destroys democracy in France by crowning himself emperor and going right back to a monarchy, but on the other hand, his civil code of 1804, often called the Napoleonic Code, freed peasants from serfdom and rationalized administration in conquered territories like Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. This massive legal shift wiped out ancient privileges based on birth and firmly secured property rights. Suddenly, you had businessmen, artisans, and small-scale producers realizing that these uniform laws and standardized systems were incredibly beneficial for moving and trading goods across regions that used to be bogged down by local aristocratic rules.
But it certainly wasn't all sunshine and liberation. This painting of the planting of the Tree of Liberty in Germany brilliantly captures the mixed reality of the era. The sarcastic German plaque on the tree reveals how initial enthusiasm for the French, who were initially viewed as liberators, soured pretty fast. If you look closely at the French soldiers in the painting, they aren't exactly acting like saviors. They are actively harassing women, seizing a peasant's cart on the left, and forcing a local man to his knees right in the center. The local populations realized quite rapidly that Napoleon's administrative efficiency came at a very high cost: forced conscription, brutal censorship, heavy taxation, and a total loss of their political freedom.
Naturally, the backlash to this oppressive reality was immense, ultimately leading to the massive fragmentation of Napoleon's empire. This is humorously captured in this 1813 caricature, which shows the once great conqueror as a sad, retreating postman. He's rushing back to France, hastily dropping letters from his bag, and each letter actually represents a territory he has lost. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, the grand illusion of French invincibility was permanently shattered, and the map of Europe was about to be completely and messily redrawn once again.
The fall of Napoleon in 1815 triggered a huge chain reaction, and it certainly wasn't a peaceful transition back to the old ways. Instead, it sparked decades of continuous struggles and revolutions that slowly forced today's independent nation-states into existence. From the Greek struggle for independence starting in 1821, through the explosive, widespread revolutions of 1848, right up to the eventual unification of Italy and Germany, the 19th century was utterly defined by this violent, persistent struggle to align political borders with true national identities.
Finally, Section 5, Rise of Liberal Nationalism, A Continent Divided.
So how did these fragmented patchwork empires made up of incredibly diverse groups actually transform into unified nations? We have to look behind the scenes at the people pulling the strings. It ultimately came down to a fierce, structural clash of social classes. For centuries, a tiny, deeply entrenched landed aristocracy held absolute power. They were united by an elite French-speaking lifestyle, and they owned massive country estates cultivated by serfs. But suddenly, they found their power challenged. The Industrial Revolution bred a completely new group, a commercially driven middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen, and professionals. This rapidly growing middle class demanded liberal freedoms, open markets, and most importantly, the complete abolition of aristocratic privileges. They became the true driving force behind the ideas of national unity.
However, and there's a big catch here, we must remember that this early wave of liberal nationalism was far from perfectly egalitarian. Liberalism stood for the freedom of the individual and equality before the law, but that equality had very strict, unyielding boundaries. In these early political experiments, men without property and absolutely all women were completely excluded from any political rights. Voting was considered a privilege exclusively for property-owning men. It was a crucial step toward modern democracy, tearing down aristocratic rule, but it was certainly not the finish line for human equality.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you to ponder a profound warning from Ernst Renan. He said, "Their existence is a guarantee of liberty, which would be lost if the world had only one law and only one master." Does dividing our world into individual nation-states genuinely guarantee our personal freedom, or is it merely an illusion of liberty? Renan strongly believed that nations were a necessity to prevent a single master from ruling the globe, acting as a crucial check on absolute power. Take a moment to reflect on everything we've covered today, from Soria's utopian art to the bloody march of Napoleon to that fierce clash of social classes. Think about the modern world we live in right now. Are nations the true guardians of our freedom today? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this source material. Keep asking those great questions, and I will see you in the next explainer.